spontaneous movements or stereotypies, right? A form of involuntary movement. We looked at infant reflexes, also involuntary movements. Okay. Now we're going to transition into what happens as the infant starts to develop voluntary skills, right? So on page 114 in your book, there is a table there that has some of the motor milestones. These ones come particularly from an assessment tool called the Bailey scale. There are other milestones that the chapter discusses that aren't on that list because that's from the scale. Okay. The range that you see of ages is still pretty accurate, so we'll talk about that in a minute. What we're looking at initially are rudimentary skills, so don't get confused here. They use the term fundamental, but it's not our fundamental motor skills that we're looking at on the chart. All right, so on your notes you might want to just change that to rudimentary. We're looking at initial skills that the child can move voluntarily. All right, so at this point, what we're seeing is the reflexes are starting to weaken. Some of them disappear. All right, we get some motor interference, and we see voluntary movements starting to occur. Okay. They act as building blocks. So it's the next level of building block that leads to more complex motor skills. So we have to go through this rudimentary phase before we can get to our fundamental motor skills, our throwing, our catching, our running. Okay. These skills are cumulative, so we see a sequence. They build on each other. Okay. And they're pretty consistent. So the list that's in that table was researched a long, long time ago. And it's arguable that we have better nutrition now, we have better prenatal care, we have better education for new mums, and so it would be reasonable to say, well then wouldn't we see these motor milestones at an earlier age? Because there's all this positive change has occurred. And so when you look at the average age, we might see that a little bit earlier now. But what we know from the current research is that the range still holds true, right? So modern day infants attain these milestones roughly the same time as they did 80 years ago, according to the World Health Organization. Right? So they looked at a lot of children in several different countries to look at whether or not these milestones are occurring about the same time, or do we need to alter the range. It's all about what can we identify as typical, what's not typical. Because if we can identify something as not typical early enough, we might be able to intervene and help that child and improve their outlook long term. Right? So, specific movements. We've got constraints changing all the time, so across this first year, there's a lot of growth. Remember how steep our growth curves are during that first year. Lots of constraint changes. The skeleton is changing, the muscular system is changing, right? the structure and function of all the systems is developing rapidly during that first year. So we see some big changes in the movement patterns that we observe. And I wanted to show you a couple of other models here that aren't in this textbook, because I think they help us get this picture of it being a building block. We have to achieve each level to move on to the next level. All right, so here, this particular pyramid model was developed in 1980. And on this model, we have reflexes down here. Okay. And we've got walking, so we've also got some rudimentary skills. We've got grasping. And then on top of that foundation, we have fundamental motor skills. So we've got running, we've got hopping, jumping, kicking. Right. And in this model, we also have some rudimentary, so they kind of mix the rudimentary across, because here we've got crawling, creeping, right, sitting. Those would be rudimentary. But the nice thing about this model is this proficiency barrier. Okay? Because what the model is trying to get us to recognize is that in order to move from fundamental movements, in order to become skilled at moving and learn lifetime movement skills or specific sports skills maybe, we have to get across the proficiency barrier. Okay. So what that's trying to say is I've got to be pretty good at all these fundamental skills in order to move on and learn a specific sports skill or a lifetime activity skill. Yes, sir?
Well, like there's some young kids that kind of just like plow right through that. So like I saw a video of a 5-year-old dribbling the ball, picking up a cone, switching hands, and so does it really have to do with early childhood development, or can you develop those adult-like skills early?
You can, but he would have gone through
Like
this fundamental skill quickly. Yeah. So either, well, to begin with, probably genetically has very good eye-hand coordination. His perception of that is better than average. He's also got some modeling, so maybe older siblings or a parent who does that. Maybe the parents are really into basketball and they have basketball on the telly all the time, so he's got some really good modeling. So it's not that he skipped this, it's just that he went through it at an earlier age than is typical. So yeah, I had a child back in Alabama who by the age of 4 could dribble through his legs, switch hands, turn around. I mean, it was ridiculous. But he had 3 older siblings who were all basketball players.
Prodigy.
Yeah. So that's not typical. It's lovely to see, but it's not typical for any stretch of the imagination. But this is not age dependent, right? It's age related, because we have to see certain strengths and perceptual developments, but it's not age dependent, just age related. So I have to get through this proficiency barrier. That means when you look at your MSU chart, right, your MSU chart would sit in here. So if I'm going to teach someone to throw a football and put a spiral on the ball, they would have to be able to do fundamental throwing before I can teach them throwing a spiral. Does that make sense? Right? So I have to be proficient at the fundamental level. So I've got to get to stage 4, stage 5, however many stages we have on that fundamental level. And then I'm able to learn the next level up, the trickier version of that skill. Right? So kicking is a good example. Right? We can kick in soccer, we can kick in football, right? I can punt, but I have to be able to run and balance and kick a ball before I can teach them how to kick in a game. Okay. That makes sense? So I don't like that they mix up the rudimentary skills on this model, but I do like this visual barrier that they put in that makes us stop and think, okay, not everybody gets here, right? Because to get up into the higher level of the model, I have to get across this barrier. That takes practice, it takes some good teaching, some good modeling, experience, right? And then another model, that I wanted to show you that you see around a lot in the literature, probably more so than the other one, was developed by Gallagher and Osman for a textbook that they wrote. And they have actually updated it now. In the new edition of the textbook, they've added some other bits to the model. But the original basic model, again, I think gives us a nice visual. Models are just tools to help us understand what we're looking at, all right? And here they have, here's our reflexes, right? On top of that, we have rudimentary movement phases, right? And I have to build the sand. So I have to put more sand in to get up to fundamental. And I have to put more sand in if I want to get anywhere close to specialized movement phase. And the bottleneck is supposed to represent that I don't get to lifelong daily activities or specialized competitive activities unless I can put lots of experience in down here. Right? So not very many people move through the bottleneck. You guys aren't typical, right? You're very good up here. That's not normal. The vast majority of people get stuck down here. Right? Does that make sense? So the models are just useful tools, helpful visuals to give us some idea of another way of explaining what we're seeing. Alright, so what are some of our motor milestones? Right? Most of them have something to do with developing posture. Alright, developing enough strength to change posture and become independent movers. Right? So this one, can you see this video if I click on here? At 2 months, they start to be able to lift their head in a prone position. So, and then by 3 months, they're strong enough to be able to lift their head up, right? So this child is on its tummy, it's picking its head. Remember that picture of the ratio, how big that head is in comparison to the rest of its body. So that's a big difference, being able to lift my head up. Okay? Because now I can look around the room, right? I can start to get inquisitive and look at things, put together a sound with an action. If I hear someone coming and then they come through the door. We can't do that. Can you see that?
Yeah.
We need the light off. It's okay. Right? When you're looking at the development of lifting their head up like this, you're always going to see them lift their head up from their tummy first. Okay? So think about that logically. How big are those muscles on the back of your neck, right? Versus how big are the muscles that move your head forwards? Okay. So these great big muscles at the back here, right, can lift that great big weight before these muscles can lift that great big weight. So let's see. We'll borrow George. Bird. Okay. So at the back, we've got that big, thick muscle there that runs supraspinatus. It's a long time since I did my anatomy,
and then
right?
it attaches to the lats. Okay.
Right. So we've got lots of big muscles at the back here, and at the front, we have a relatively small muscle that runs on the diagonal. Right? So this head is huge. It weighs a lot. And so what we see in the developmental trend is baby can lift its head this way before it can lift its head this way. That's important because that means that that baby needs to have tummy time. Right? And there was a point where parents were told not to put their baby on their tummy at all because people were nervous that sudden infant death syndrome was caused by laying the baby on their tummy and then they were suffocating, right? But if you don't give them tummy time, then you slow down their developmental trend, right? If I'm lying here, staring at the ceiling, right, I can't move this head, it weighs a ton. So all I get to do is stare at the ceiling for hours and hours, right? There's not a lot of cognitive development going on there, okay? If I can do this, and then I can start looking around, now we get cognitive development as well as motor development. Right? So it's really important that we give them both options. So by 2 months, 8 weeks, if they've had tummy time, they're going to start lifting their head somewhere on average. Right? Remember, these are all averages. By 12 weeks, they'll be strong enough to start lifting their shoulders up a little bit. Right? By 5 months, then, they start to be able to roll over and possibly be sitting unsupported. Okay? So the rolling over looks very much like the reflex that we looked at last week. Right? Can I do it? Can I do it? Can I do it? Ah, there we go. Right? So quite a bit later than them lifting their head up. That's 5 months. Okay. Sitting unsupported doesn't look like a very good sit because generally by 5 months what they can manage to do is if you prop them, right, so that their center of gravity is over their base there, they can manage to hold that. Right? But it's not quite the same as being able to sit up here and maintain my center of gravity over my bottom without swaying and falling. Right? They do a lot of rolling over and falling when they're 4 to 5, 6 months. By 7 months, they'll get up onto their hands and knees on average, and again, you don't see them move straight away, right? So when I get up onto my hands and knees, things start to get a bit tricky for my brain. Okay? Because if I'm on my hands and knees, now what do I do? Okay? So in order to move from here, I have to be able to shift my weight and lift a hand or a leg. Right? So my brain has to understand how far it can tip and shift. Right? The other thing that has to happen is think about when you're doing your press-ups and things. Right? How strong the front of your shoulder has to be to have your weight on your hands. So there's a lot of strength, so when they first get up on their hands and knees, you don't see them move. They get up on their hands and knees and they kind of rock backwards and forwards for a couple of weeks, right? They just kind of hang out there, rocking around on their hands and knees like they've got a little mojo going on in their head, right? There's some music going on in there somewhere. They just rock around. Well, that's great because that's training the muscles in the shoulders, the muscles in the triceps. It's also teaching the brain where balance is. Right? So we see a lot of that for a few weeks before you actually see them move. In between, before they creep, you might see them crawl. So some babies will crawl. Crawling is where they're on their tummy and they kind of pull themselves along with their hands, and they do this like seal waggle. The legs are waggling around at the back on the floor, right? So some will do that. And then typically around 8 months, we see creeping on their hands and knees. Not always, because this is very has a strong environmental influence, right? So if I have big spaces with shiny wood floors, then some children don't creep. They bum scoot instead, because it's more effective on a big shiny wooden floor. So instead of going up on their hands and knees and creeping, they sit up and they scoot themselves along on their nappy with their heels, and they scoot around on their bum, right? It's very cool to watch. It's also quite advanced developmentally because it frees up their hands so they can get into anything a lot quicker. Child that's creeping, right? I'm creeping around. When I get to something I want to touch, now I have to stop. I've got to get my weight back. I've got to manage to get upright without falling over, and now I can grab. So scooters tend to be a little more advanced at getting into things they shouldn't be getting into. Mum and Dad's life changes dramatically once they can self-locomote. It's great when you can put them down on the blanket and go away and make a cup of tea and come back and they're still there on the blanket. Okay? You can't do that now. Those days are gone forever once they start to self-locomote. Right? Now you've got to have eyes in the back of your head all the time. Where are they? What are they doing? What are they touching? So, by 9 months, they've got enough strength and they're getting really inquisitive, they're into everything. They manage to start to pull themselves up on the furniture and stand up. Okay? So, we mentioned previously that controlling the hip girdle is one of the biggest problems the brain has to overcome when it's transitioning to standing. So what they do first, they hold on to something, they stand up, and there's all this wobbling going on, but they've got something to hang on to, so it's okay, right? Depending upon how your furniture is laid out, you might see them cruise. So cruising is, okay, I'm try and I want to have a look at that over there. And I'm going to see if I can get over there. But if there's a great big gap in the furniture, I get back down on my hands and knees and I creep, right? So cruising is along the furniture, hanging on, standing up. Creeping is on hands and knees. So let's see.
Dr. Wong,
Yes.
is it possible to like do these things too soon? Because like for like bone formation and stuff?
Probably not, because the brain wouldn't let the baby do it. I mean, the bones are still developing at this point, but part of that development is they have to have some weight on them. So you're not going to see full mineralization of the femur and the tibia and fibula until the child is standing on those bones. So they're linked together. Neurologically, they have to be developed enough to be able to control both sides of their body and do something different. Right? If I'm going to walk, even if I'm hanging on to something, that means I'm moving one foot while I'm not moving the other foot. That means that both sides of my brain have to be able to coordinate that. So there's a lot of system development going on while we see this. Can you damage the child? I guess maybe if you spend a lot of time holding the child up on their feet and, you know, but I'm not sure that you could, because the brain's just not going to let them stand up. If you get, you know, when you see children with very legs that bow out a lot,
Yeah.
that's not because they stood up and walked too soon. That's to do with the shape of the hip socket. It sometimes is nutritional. So, does that answer your question? Let's have a look and see what this one looks like. So remember, all these clips are on your website with your textbook. As you're looking at this information, it's much easier to follow what the book is telling us if you're looking at a picture. All right, so they're trying to encourage her. There's a toy dangling away. See all the wobble? Okay. Lots of wobble. So at this point, there's no way that this child is ready to stand on their own, because the brain doesn't have this under control yet. Okay. Give it a couple of weeks though. Right? If you allow them to pull themselves up and hang out holding on to something, they'll sit down when they're ready, cruise around on your furniture. By 10 months, on average, they're going to be able to stand. Right? So that's a big step, because now I can stand without holding on to something. I don't have to have mum hanging on to me. That means that I'm getting strong enough and my brain is coordinated enough that I've got control of this wibbly wobbly hip girdle. So it doesn't take very long. Once we start, we give them the opportunity to practice. And on average, they'll walk around 12 months, right? That's an average. Some children walk as early as 9 months. I've heard of children walking at 8 months, but that's highly unusual. But 9 to 10 months. Sometimes they don't walk until 15 or 16 months. They just can't be bothered. Or they live in an environment where an older sibling or a parent brings them everything they need. So you've got to watch out for that, because bringing them everything they need means I don't have to stand up and walk, right? All I've got to do is sit here and look cute, and I get everything I need. Walking is a way of exploring. So remember our term rate limiters, right? A rate limiter when we're looking at infants is going to be an individual constraint. So one of the systems that's developing that inhibits or slows the attainment of a motor skill. So I have to be strong enough. My brain has to understand stability and balance. Where is balance? Right? Which muscles do I turn on to maintain balance? Environmentally, we also have constraints. Right? Culturally, first child syndrome in the States is something you sometimes see. So a new mom is very nervous with her baby and she hangs on to it all the time. So carries it around on her hip a lot, doesn't like to put it on the floor, right? Doesn't want to put the baby on its tummy. Those kinds of parental behaviors can delay crawling and creeping. Right? And if we delay crawling and creeping, then we see a knock-on delay to cognition. Right? The milestone itself might act as the rate limiter. So I can't stand up if I can't sit up. Right? If I can't control my trunk and my hips enough to sit, then I can't control them enough to stand. So we see sitting before we see standing. Right? If they're reaching and grasping, the skill can act as the rate limiter. So when they're sitting, when we look at the development of reaching and grasping, next chapter, they'll get to a point where they'll reach and grasp with one hand. But when they stand up, they go back to reaching and grasping with two hands. Because standing is a big enough challenge in itself, the brain goes back to an easier form of reaching and grasping. So the skill itself, the development of the milestone may impact the behavior that we see. So lots of different constraints, keep going back to our triangle, lots of different constraints going on that impact the motor behavior that is observed from the outside. All right, so we've said a delay in motor development can result in delays to later fundamental motor skills according to those models. Right? It can act to create a delay just in daily activities, in cognition, in social development, in sensory integration, which is really crucial. So when we look at perception action, I have to be able to understand the depth of something or the shape of something in order to understand how that object works. Right? When I'm looking at posture, sitting and standing, right, then controlling that posture means that I'm able to be on balance. Right? If I can't control my posture here, I can't be on balance. Right? So we have to get strong enough to be able to find out what balance means for our brain. Right? And so there's a lot of research looking at infants because do they use the same cues to work on their posture and their balance as an adult does? And so they look at the conflict between visual and kinesthetic, and I've got a little piece of film here to show you. They'll put adults and children into what they call a moving room. So you stand and they move 3 walls backwards and forwards. Well, when you do that to an adult, what you see is the adult do this. but they don't fall over, they maintain their balance. But their sway gets bigger because we tend to rely too much on our visual information and not enough on kinesthetic information. Right? So they give us a conflict. I'm not moving, so all the kinesthetic receptors in my ankles, my knees, my hips are all telling my brain I'm stationary. But the walls are moving. So my eyes are telling my brain that I'm moving. And so my brain makes postural adjustments that aren't appropriate because I'm not moving. So when they looked at babies, they saw something similar. Even by 2 months old, okay, the babies react to the visual stimulus rather than the kinesthetic information. Right? So they've looked at infants all the way through to 13 months old when they're starting to walk. And what they find is the more experience they've got with sitting or standing, then the quicker the postural reaction happens. You put these little children into a moving room and they fall over because they don't react quickly enough. So let's have a look. The brain can start to calibrate sensory information at a very young age, which was not something we understood. Where's that going to open up? Okay, I'm sure if it will work.
In most adults, even when doing a difficult task, the sway is small and balance is easily maintained. But if visual information is important, then it should be possible to upset a subject's balance in an experimental room by moving the room gently forwards or backwards. Infants learning to stand are less stable than the adult and far more easily put off balance. The infant in this experiment has only been walking for a month. When we move the room backwards, the child falls. And again. In 92 trials of this type, 7 infants, balance was clearly disturbed in the predicted direction in 82% of the trials. It seems then that for the infant learning to maintain balance, visual information is far more potent than mechanical information.
When we're adults, we can use both sets. We use the visual because
But
that's
the
what makes
adult
us sway, but we
is less
can.
sensitive to conflict between visual and mechanical information, and movements of the room do not, as with the infant, knock him over. But let us give him an unfamiliar balancing task, such as standing on a narrow beam. With his eyes closed, he depends solely on mechanical stimuli, quickly becomes unstable and falls off. Or, with his eyes open, if the room is moved, even slightly, he will lose his balance, just as the infant did.
Very fun. So we respond very quickly to visual stimuli, even as adults, if we're challenged. Uh-oh. That can't be good. So what they think with the small children is that what we're looking at for a rate limiter is how do I couple the sensory information to the motor response. So what do I do with that information and what kind of reaction do I send to the muscles in response to that sensory information? So coupling becomes the ability to couple the information, the info from the eyes with the signal to the leg muscles becomes the rate limiter. So, Stereotype is reflexes, rudimentary milestones. So we get voluntary movement. Child can reach and grasp, they can sit up deliberately, they can creep, they're going to stand, and they're going to walk around 12. So by 12 months, we've got a lot of voluntary movement, very few reflexes left at 12 months, right? Not that we see anyway. We can't elicit the reflex on most of those reflexes by 12 months, right? The brain is transitioned into voluntary movement and the reflexes are kind of dormant. We're not sure that they go away. Remember the bathtub experiment? Right? They may not go away, they're just not useful now. I don't need them. So they get weaker and weaker. The response gets weaker because now I can control this body for myself. Right?